Thank you all for joining us. It's very much appreciated. So my name is Louisa Knox. I am a pension partner here at Shepherd and Wedderburn, but I am also our board sponsor for Net Zero. I'm delighted. I'm joined by Gordon Downie. Gordon is head of regulation, and Gordon and I both lead our ESG advisory group. I'm also joined by Gillian Carty, who is a litigator, but leads on our people strategy, so very much covering the S for the social. So in terms of this morning's agenda, we are going to be working through the points on the page, but I want to thank all of you, for coming along in this first of a full series of webinars. So as part of our ESG advisory group, we will be running seminars over the coming months looking at different areas. So this first one, as you can see from the agenda, is a broad overview of ESG. It's vital, as we all know, to all organisations. I think it's very much sitting at the top of the agenda. We're in what I would call a constantly evolving area, and I know that as both an advisor and also as somebody who's leading on our journey to net zero. Obviously, when organisations such as those you're representing this morning are looking at your own targets and your ambitions, there are clearly challenges which we've been supporting clients with on their journeys. But I think as we work through this morning, hopefully we're going to give you that broad overview, and I'm going to talk a bit about the next webinars that we have coming up. So please do use the Q&A. So there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. So please do use that Q&A function to log any additional questions. And for those of you who were kind enough to submit your questions in advance, we will try and pick them up as we're going along, and any that don't pick up as we go along, we'll touch on at the Q&A session at the end. And we're just going to work through a bit of a recap. So I'm going to hand over to Gordon. We're going to work through a recap on the pillars that sit underneath sustainability, 5 key challenges that everyone I think is facing. We're then going to talk about our own strategy development. So we're going to use us as a case study. So there's a little bit this morning of us laying ourselves bare for you all. We're very happy to share the challenges we've faced. And for some of you, you'll be very advanced on your journeys. So this might not be news to you, but I'm hoping, as everything, if I attend something and you take away 1 or 2 points of interest, that can be helpful. But we're also very happy to share your own observations on your own journey as we're going through. And then obviously we'll touch on the upcoming webinars. So the session we're recording, and the slides and recording will be available afterwards. We recognise diaries sometimes are such that watching it in the recording is a benefit afterwards. So Gordon, without further ado, let me pass over to you, and thank you all.
Thanks, Louisa. So as Louisa just said, we thought it would be useful to kick off by recapping briefly on the 3 pillars of ESG. So these 3 slides just provide a very high level recap of those pillars. So left-hand side, we set out the pillar, in this case the environmental pillar, and then look at the dimensions of that particular pillar. In other words, the sort of the touch points with your organization and your activities. In this case, the products, services that you offer, the supply chain distribution relationships that you have in your operations, and then the sorts of topics around which your ESG strategy will be develop measures and reporting communications. The environmental one, very familiar, I'm sure, to everyone. If I could have the next slide, we move on to the second pillar, social pillar, and similar set of dimensions against which the social aspects of ESG are impacting on businesses, and then again the topics that are particularly pertinent in thinking about the social aspect of ESG. And I was saying to Louisa and Gillian earlier this morning, it's quite topical. The social pillar is quite topical, and Philip Morris, there's a piece in this morning's FT about Philip Morris's ambition to be a leading ESG stock. And for a company like Philip Morris, it is very much thinking about the product market they operate in, very much the social pillar, social responsibility that they're thinking about, I'm sure, in transforming themselves as an ESG stock. And then thirdly, the next slide shows us the governance pillar of ESG, different set of dimensions against which one encounters governance issues, transparency, accountability, and independence, and ethical behaviour for firms to assess their performance and set their strategy. What we thought might be useful before we move on to the challenges posed in implementing an ESG strategy against these pillars is to just get your thoughts about your own ESG journeys. So again, by using the Menti URL at the top of the screen and typing in the code, you'll be able to provide your own feedback on your own journey and against those three pillars, the environmental, social, and governance pillars of ESG, indicate where your organisation might be and how far along that journey from getting going to, and perhaps one's never at the fully implemented stage, but the fully implemented stage one happens to be. So interesting to see the balance there that people are seem to be striking at the moment between the three pillars. As I said, environmental one probably better understood in many respects, more commentary around environmental sustainability than almost anything else. But question in terms of achieving or fully implementing the environmental one, is that perhaps the hardest of all of the pillars to strive for, whereas perhaps the other ones maybe easier to get one's arms around. Louisa, I don't know if you've got any observations on that sort of relative difficulty point.
I think that's absolutely right, Gordon. I think what we're seeing in the environmental space is particular pressure on organisations. The E, with underpinning data, and there are all sorts of challenges on data, which actually will probably form another one of our webinars in the series, just in terms of availability of data and the smoothing of data. But I think there's such a focus on the E, Gordon. I think there's almost been a priority on looking at the E and the climate change emergency, and the others perhaps governance looked at as a kind of, oh well, that will be done. But the social one is difficult, and I know Gillian's going to touch on that, Gordon, because it's one of the areas, Gillian, particularly there, which is a real focus for us, but also just making sure we are tracking that in a particular way. You might have a couple of observations.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that absent gender pay gap reporting, which I'll come on to talk about in a wee minute, there's really no kind of benchmark to measure progress against, and it really varies very, very much sector to sector. And I think it's an area that people find harder to work out where should they be prioritising. The governance element of it, because there's an overlap obviously between the three. I think the governance element in terms of things like equal pay or whatever, people are familiar with their obligations, but how do they tackle the rest of it? And I think that can sometimes be the one that ends up in the too hard box.
Okay, so we should move on to the next slide. Thank you. Which is really just a recap what in kind of our perception tend to be the key issues firms face in developing ESG strategies, and we'll provide an opportunity for your feedback on these in a few minutes. But just taking them in the order they appear on this slide. First one we've got there is focus, which is really around firms assessing where they are in their ESG journey and what best practice looks like for them within that context. And that, of course, involves thinking about the sector that they're in and the relative importance of the E, the S and the G risks within the sector and for the firm. Often, of course, the E is prioritised, but clearly the other pillars shouldn't be neglected. And I think it's always important to look at what others in your sector are doing for inspiration and lessons learned purposes, and then thinking about your own activities, framing goals and KPIs that are tailored appropriately. I think another way of looking at this is sort of proportionality. What's a proportionate approach, and a nonetheless challenging approach to setting strategy. Communication is the next one. Clearly, ESG strategies can't be developed in a vacuum, and it's important to engage effectively with stakeholders when doing so, both in terms of framing the strategy and also in terms of testing how well it is being implemented. And I think that means thinking carefully about who your stakeholders are and how best to engage with them and find out their views. And incidentally, on the topic of communication, effective communication is critical when emphasising your firm's commitment to the strategy. Resources, very important, not only from the point of view of money and budgets, but also people. So developing an effective ESG strategy is an investment in the firm's future. So devoting sufficient resource is going to be critical. Otherwise, you run the risk that the strategy is perceived as superficial. That might mean investment in systems and processes, as well as things like recruitment. And of course, the resources that you deploy have to be well directed and coordinated. So this involves looking at how accountability for the firm's strategy is managed and how roles are framed. Data, already been mentioned. One of the most crucial and at the same time most challenging aspects of an ESG strategy, since measuring and reporting on the effectiveness of the strategy is fundamentally dependent on having robust data and a disciplined approach to data management. Again, it's important here to think about priorities and what sorts of data are actually going to be most useful in measuring success. And in many cases, what one might have to do is actually create a baseline set of data from which to measure improvement. And then last, but certainly not least, is the challenge posed by standards. And in this world, this ESG world, working out which of the multiple and evolving, so doubly difficult sets of challenges there, the multiple and evolving standards and frameworks that the firm's strategy ought to be aligned with. On the one hand, it's important that your strategy is aligned so as to allow its performance to be properly benchmarked. But on the other hand, the existence of competing standards, it means having to think carefully about which ones are right for your business, bearing in mind, for instance, the expectation of your particular set of stakeholders. So the next slide, again, gives you an opportunity to feedback and suggest, from your point of view of your own organisation, how you would rank. I have chosen not to rank in my presentation the challenges. There'll be different views about which
I know it's very interesting. I think, Gordon, it's suffice to say that the 5 challenges you've identified are clearly challenges, for us and as an organisation, and for many others on the call. And I agree with you on the communication. It's the disclosures that people have made either in the past or that they would make in the future, and ensuring that those disclosures are really tested, to make sure that there can be no accusations, for example, of greenwashing, which I know is something that people are very alive to at the moment.
And I think we'll be coming on to that in a subsequent webinar, won't we, in terms of the risks there? Yeah,
absolutely. Yes, the disclosure one's going to form a whole webinar, I think, of its own. Thank you, Gordon.
Okay, so I think we'll probably move on, Louisa, to the next.
Absolutely. Thank you, Gordon. So if I pick up on our ESG strategy development, and as I said earlier, we're laying ourselves bare here a bit and using ourselves as a case study for you all to see how we've gone about this. But we very much have a culture and values that have underpinned our organisation for years. We have been allowed for a long time, and having looked at this business as being sustainable in its truest sense, that's something obviously that we wanted to retain. But we did step back to look at the sustainability concept, our environmental impact, people strategy, and that process was led by the board. But we identified sponsors from the board. Gillian and myself are 2 of the sponsors with you today, but also project leaders within the business, and we drew on external support, recognising that we are lawyers and we do then need to engage with other organisations. So, for example, we have an environmental consultancy who helps us with our data, given the challenges we all have on data, and they also help us with our environmental commitments. So having carried out that full review, we also recognised that we had multiple policies already in place underpinning those values and compliance. So we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We want to build and grow on what we've got, but also recognising that we have to be, dynamic and making sure that strategic framework that we were developing was aligned with the firm's goals and values, but very much kicking us forward and taking us, always trying to evolve. We're all on a journey. So anyone who's involved in ESG in their own organisations at the moment will know that we are on an evolving journey. So just when you think you've got, to the top of the hill, you see another peak ahead. So you just have to keep climbing. And one of the things that we were very alive to was making sure we were engaging with all the stakeholders. And Gordon's recognised already, the communication challenges, saying what we're doing and being really open and transparent, which is why, as I say, we're happy to sort of lay ourselves bare today and talk about this, and that will hopefully give you some tips for your own journeys. But looking at our communication plan, we've got significant training that's already rolled out within the firm, but looking at it in this ESG space and our policy approach and getting buy-in across the firm. So as I mentioned earlier, Gordon and I have got kind of two hats, which is ESG advisory, client facing, but Gillian and I have this internal requirement as well for our own ESG space. Thank you, Laura. If you could move on one slide, thank you. So actually taking the strategic drop down and making sure we've got this, and bringing back that focus and the standards. So assessing where we were, where we want to be, and setting targets and ambitions with having route maps underneath, with kind of plans that we're trying to deliver against to achieve that. We are a supplier to all of you for services, but we are also a buyer, a purchaser of services. So we have interest in both spaces, and that will be the same for many of you. And I know some of the questions that are coming through are about that supply chain procurement. And we will be running a session on procurement, but what I would say is we as a business always seek to put some contractual terms into our suppliers so that we know that they are aligned with us and the way we are going about our journey. Now, we have to recognise we are of a particular scale. So we are about 500 people across the firm, multiple offices. But we are not of the scale of some of the global organisations whose buying power allows them a different sphere of influence. But there is a little bit of us piggybacking on some of the coattails of others who are able to make that influence and change suppliers. The disclosures that organisations have to make is also helping us, because those suppliers are similarly under the same pressure that all of us are on the webinar today. From a governance point of view, as you can imagine, we are very heavily regulated, and we also are compliance heavy internally. So we're very comfortable in that space. Environmental, we have a big clean energy practice and a long-standing commitment to minimising impact on climate. I'll come back just to talk about that in a bit more detail. Gillian's going to touch on our social and people strategy, because one of the big issues that we've all got in terms of data and standards from a social point of view, and the S can be a little bit forgotten, and now Gillian, this is something you're going to touch on, is about some of the steps that we have been taking to almost measure ourselves, I would say, is what we are trying to do, and I think that will hopefully be helpful for some of you, and just some ideas about what we are doing. Getting buy-in right across the firm from all colleagues was really important to us. And we do have the ESG statement popped up on our website, recognising, as I said earlier, this is one where we constantly evolve. It's like cutting the grass, it constantly grows. Thank you, Laura. So if I turn to our net zero journey, and that's where I am our board sponsor for net zero. As I mentioned, we're very much in the environmental space. We have a very long-standing clean energy practice. So we've got expert solicitors who are advising all the time on this space. So that was actually quite helpful, because we've got that internal knowledge, and then looking at us as a business was really helpful. Claire Foster, who leads our clean energy sector, and I have worked quite closely together in terms of our net zero journey, and as you'll see further down in the slide, we have signed up to the Edinburgh Climate Compact, and Claire is one of the commissioners on the Edinburgh Climate Commission and was involved in the compact. So we were an early signatory to that, and again, Edinburgh as a city is has ambitions to be net zero for 2030 with lots of steps in place. So it all aligned. We've been reporting publicly for years. We're tracking everything. We don't have very many levers. We can track travel, commuting, energy, waste that's produced. minimising our paper use has been another key facet. But we did have a reset, and Gillian's going to talk about the timeline for the social aspects, but COVID-19 notwithstanding, we had all these policies, was a reset point for us in saying, okay, we are not producing carbon in the same way that we were. Let's reset. So by the time the restrictions are lifted and we're back in the office, we've got already that culture change. So it's all about changing culture and embedding into culture and then leading to carbon reduction. So we do have route maps with targets. We're constantly refining them and working at the moment with our consultants who've been incredibly helpful. And also we have a carbon reduction plan in place. Now, we as a supplier know the pressure that's on our clients in the same net zero journey that most are on, and feeding into to those clients and showcasing giving transparency on what we are trying to do, but also being open and honest that we know we are on a journey and we can't switch this, overnight. We are still a service provider. We still need to be able to function, as a law firm. We need the lights on. We're using kit as we speak to you this morning. So inevitably, there's a carbon collection point, a data point in all of those. Thank you, Laura. So if we look at what we did internally, and I would recommend this highly, our colleagues are very engaged, and I would say this has been a lovely touch point for all of us. We had enforced carbon literacy training, so everyone has to attend annual training with me and our environmental consultants, but we went right back to basics to talk about what the climate emergency meant. Some of us, and I'm a pension lawyer by trade, so ESG is a concept in the pensions industry, and I know some of my colleagues in the industry are attending today. ESG is already a concept that we're well used to. Climate change emergency is something that's embedded through pension scheme investments, and therefore I'm probably reasonably well versed already before I started being the net zero sponsor on the UN commitments, the Paris Agreement, and where we were in COP. But for some of our colleagues, particularly those, we've got people who are delivering mail around the firm who wouldn't necessarily have been engaged as the solicitors who are working in clean energy. So we wanted to put a bit of a leveler of training in, and that was enforced training. So everybody had to either sit through the training or watch the recording, but very much trying to embed that culture of we want to make a difference, we want to reduce our carbon footprint, and this is why it's not just important for the business, but it's actually important for the wider community and for our place in ensuring that we are part of that journey of reducing carbon impacts in the globe. So we have a sustainability environmental policy that gets reviewed every year, and then obviously we have the statement, which was the output of our our journey to having our all of our various steps in place. Personal carbon footprints. What we were doing, and actually an app was recommended to me the other day for colleagues to use to kind of track their own carbon footprints, but we try and encourage people to think about that. We've got all these wellness to work, encouraging people to cycle, walk where you can, think about the benefits of travel in a low impact way. Thank you, Laura. So if I look at all these policies, so that you can read that through on the screen there, we're aiming for a meaningful reduction. So we will only offset what we can't reduce, and inevitably there's always going to be, I think, for any business. And one of the questions that came through was, can we truly get to net zero? Well, I think if we look at net zero as being meaningful, proper reduction with, plans in place to make that reduction, there will still be some offsetting. We will look at sort of positive carbon offsetting. We don't want that just to be a tick box exercise. We want that to be meaningful. That's really important to us. But inevitably touched on data standards, all of those, we're all over that in terms of the carbon footprint calculation. And obviously post-COVID, having lived in this lovely world where everything felt much, more environmentally friendly, businesses go back to work, people go back, and that's a challenge. And I'm very happy to share that is one of the challenges, is trying to maintain that reset. And we have constant reminders both internally and externally to make sure people are complying with the policies and very alive to it. So thank you, Laura. So I want to hand over to Gillian now, who's going to talk through the journey in a bit more detail. And obviously Gillian and I were part of finalising our ESG approach and making sure that's rolled out, and also in the ESG statement, Gillian. So I think the G part of that, that's governed by us all, we do love the law and we're very much embedded in the law, but I think for the S part, that's going to be something I think that's of interest to organisations today, because I know that's something that's really developing, but with maybe a bit more of a spotlight coming onto it, I would say. So Gillian, thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Louisa. Yeah, I thought it might be helpful just to talk about our journey in terms of this kind of timeline and walk you through how it's evolved. I think given the nature of our business, because we're obviously a provider of legal services, then some of the elements that Gordon talked about earlier around the social pillar, around products and services and supply chain, they don't really apply to us quite as much. So probably most of what I'm going to talk about this morning is going to be the work we've done on diversity and inclusion, around well-being, and then some of the workforce issues around training and skills development. So I think it's fair to say that our journey on this probably started back in about 2011, when we started to engage in initiatives in the legal sector around social mobility. So certainly speaking personally, that was before the ESG terminology was even known or understood to me. We've also worked with investors and people for many, many years, and that probably helped shape our initial thinking as issues around representation and inclusion started coming more to the fore in how they were evaluating organisations. But I think, being honest, it's probably fair to say that this was all quite ad hoc in the earlier years rather than strategic in terms of our thinking. Back in 2015, we first set up our first colleague network group. That started with our LGBT group in 2015, and over the course of the last 8 years, that has now grown to 6 groups, with our young persons group set up at the back end of last year. So initially, our focus was really on inclusion. And when I think about it, I probably think about it quite simplistically. I think about inclusion as being around cultural issues, around how people feel being part of an organisation. And I think of diversity as being around representation. And so that gets you into the much trickier area around data and data analysis. Our focus on data probably really only started towards the end of 2016. Any of you who were involved in it will know that larger employers at that stage were facing into the first publication of gender pay gap reporting in April 2017. So we obviously had a legal obligation to start looking at the data that we were going to be reporting as part of that first report. Now, we didn't have any concerns at all around equal pay. You'd be horrified if a group of lawyers didn't know their legal obligations there. But what was really very clear to us was that for many years, women had made up more than 50% of the graduates in the law schools that we were recruiting from. And yet, when we looked across the legal sector and the most senior roles in the legal sector, whether they were private practice roles like our own firm, in-house roles, I know some of you on the call are from legal teams in large corporates, or the judiciary or academia, then it was very clear that women were underrepresented. And it's fair to say that that was also reflected in our firm. So 2018 saw us really do an exercise starting to look at our own data, talking about developing the baseline, which I think Gordon touched on earlier. So what data did we have? What data did we think we needed to have? Where were the gaps? And we've been working on that over a number of years to try to get a solid data set and to encourage colleagues to share their personal data with us, because at the end of the day, that is something that can only be done on a voluntary basis, particularly some of the more sensitive data. We also started to engage explicitly with colleagues on issues around diversity and inclusion. We ran our first survey. We felt it was important to try to understand what the real sentiment was across our colleagues. And again, I think it's fair to say that we had to face into some pretty hard truths, particularly issues around flexibility and agility, and the impact that was having on senior female progression. So as a board, we reflected on that and we took on board the feedback from that survey. And in 2019, we launched a pilot programme, which we called our Emerging Leaders Programme. So this was an additional programme in addition to the extensive learning and development programme that you would expect from a law firm like ourselves. And it was a 2-year pilot programme, doing what it said on the tin, looking at how to develop the future and emerging leaders of our business. Importantly for us, it wasn't just available to colleagues in legal roles, and it wasn't just a female-focused initiative. It was open to everybody who met the qualifying criteria. And the feedback we've had has been really very, very positive, and all of the participants have found it a beneficial programme to be part of. But I think the feedback has particularly shown us that it's been valued by colleagues who've probably fall into the category of needing a bit more support and encouragement around the future direction of their career. So I think a particular benefit to those in underrepresented groups. 2019, we also invested in contextualised recruitment software for the first time. For us, it was important that diversity was being taken into account in all of our recruitment processes, and that's also enabled us to track candidates through their employee journey with us, so we can see not just when they join us, but how they progress their careers with us. And then in 2019, we also started working with various external organisations. And I think it's fair to say that accreditations really have been pretty useful for us, although it has taken us quite a while to work out where we get most value. Personally, I've been pretty taken aback by the number of what I call kind of pay-to-play organisations. As long as you sign up, you can use the logo, but they're not actually doing anything meaningful, in my view, to evaluate and importantly challenge. So we've not participated in that type of accreditation. It's not one that aligns with our values at all, and our focus has been on those accreditations that really do challenge us and help inform us and give us information that can help shape our approach going forward. Next slide, please, Laura. So moving forward to 2020, and actually, as I was preparing the slides, you can see that it starts getting busier, which I think is a reflection that you start to build a bit of momentum. 2020 saw us as a board approving our first strategic diversity and inclusion plan. So I think by that stage we felt we had kind of established not a perfect baseline, but a baseline that we had some confidence in. And we had informed ourselves, I think, about where we wanted to focus our efforts. So we took that plan to the board for discussion, and that plan was ultimately approved. It was initially due to take us through to 2024, but you'll see later on in the slide that was actually revised at the end of last year, and I think that's a reflection of the progress we've been able to make in that period. Linked to the plan was the introduction of board reporting twice a year. I think that's important. I think if ESG is to be seen as strategically important, as Louisa said, it needs to be embedded across the organisation, and that direction has to start from the top at board level. And I think as sponsor of our people strategy, it was also very important to me that the work we were doing on the people strategy, including the work we did on the diversity and inclusion, was really seen as strategically significant to our goals as an employer, and not just seen as an additional responsibility that fell to the HR team. By 2020, I think we obviously recognised that there was a huge amount to be done, but again, I think we had become more confident that we could become part of the conversation. So it wasn't just about internal discussions. We also recognised that we had a wider role to play in our sector, in the legal sector, and also across the business community in terms of the discussion about how we affect real and lasting change. And so we started external engagement, running events. A number of our clients were going on a similar journey, and I can see some of the names on the call, so thank you for your support and for joining us. But we started engaging with a number of our clients on how we could work together on common initiatives. And we also started a similar engagement with our own supplier base, obviously taking on board the comments that Louisa made earlier, that we, for some of them, we can be a very small player, but equally we have a sphere of influence for those where we are a significant customer for them. Picking up the theme on communication, we then introduced a monthly column in one of our internal bulletins, and we felt it was important to keep colleagues regularly appraised of what we're doing and why it's important both to us as a firm and also to our clients. And we started to celebrate some of our successes. We introduced our values awards. Now they're not just about diversity and inclusion, but our values are again very much linked to the work that we do on diversity and inclusion. Towards the end of 2020, the Law Society published quite comprehensive diversity data. And that made for very interesting reading, but not least because it really shone a light on racial diversity, or the lack of racial diversity across the profession, as a real challenge. And so we started working with those external organisations on the slides to see whether collaborating on intern programmes might help be the start of how we address that challenge. 2021, obviously, through late 2020 and into 2022, the primary focus for pretty much all organisations was on COVID and dealing with COVID and the impact. So I know that it became very challenging for many organisations to maintain a focus on ESG issues throughout that time. We really wanted to keep things going, but we recognised we were going to have to do things slightly differently. So obviously in-person events and so forth were off the table. And we turned our focus probably more internally, looking at training, awareness raising. We had a particular focus around well-being, particularly around mental health. And we ran over the piece quite a lot of internal events. It was a good way, I think, of both raising awareness and education, but also engaging with colleagues, and those events were, in our experience, very well attended. 2021, we also took the decision to try to run our second International Women's Day event, which is now an annual event. And we obviously had to move that online. We weren't quite sure how that was going to go, but we're very pleasantly surprised when we trebled the attendance at that. So that's a format that we have kept. And then in 2021, after the successful pilot, then the second cohort of delegates went on to our Emerging Leaders programme. By the end of 2021, I and some others actively involved in this area really felt that in order to make progress, we needed to recruit some more dedicated support to help us bring focus on the work. And I think to avoid the challenge, which I think many organisations can face, where ESG elements are just done off the side of people's desks, really, we decided we needed a dedicated resource. It wasn't easy for us to find the right person. This is obviously very much an emerging area, but we were fortunate to secure a very good colleague who started with us at the start of 2022. Her background is one in HR. She'd started doing some work in academia around issues of diversity and inclusion, and that she decided that was an area she wanted to focus more on. And my reflection on that is that dedicated resource has been extremely helpful in helping drive progress, but also in keeping an eye on the future, thinking ahead and horizon scanning as to where we need to be positioning ourselves going forward, so that we maintain that dynamism. Last year, we also decided to do a detailed workforce analysis, which was linked to gender pay gap reporting. I won't bore you with my thoughts on some of the challenges around the statutory requirements there, but we'd been doing gender pay gap reporting for kind of 5-6 years. We were familiar with the data we had to produce. We were familiar with the challenges around that. And like many organisations, it was really difficult to make kind of significant change. It is a slow burn. So we undertook an exercise really to try to drill down into the data in more detail, looking at how our firm was made up and the impact of different roles. One of the things I was very conscious of was that around 50% of our colleagues are not actually qualified lawyers. And we had spent a lot of work looking particularly at female lawyers in the business, and we were starting to see the benefits of that coming through. But when we looked at the data, we realised we were also affected by some wider societal issues. So, for example, we have a number of colleagues in secretarial and administration kind of support roles. Those roles typically undertaken, as they are in many organisations, by female colleagues, and a high proportion of those were part-time. So that obviously had quite an impact on our gender pay gap reporting. And equally in both finance and IT, the more senior roles tend to be dominated by male colleagues. Again, a wider, kind of business and community issue, but we're now starting to look at how we can go about tackling that. Last year, we also did the ENEI survey. If you're not familiar with ENEI, it's the Employers Network for Equality and Inclusion. We've certainly found that to be a very useful engagement over the last couple of years. We did their Tide survey, which was a fairly comprehensive assessment of where we were on issues around diversity and inclusion. We achieved a bronze award, so it's always nice to be recognised for that. But I think that obviously also shows us that we've got more that we could be doing. And I think the challenge of that assessment has really helped us shape our thinking as to how to evolve our strategic plan, and that's really what led us to refreshing our plan earlier than 2024, particularly to take on board some of the post-COVID impacts that had benefited us, but to keep challenging ourselves. Last year, we did start running our first internships with Black Professional Scotland and 10,000 Black interns. And I've also mentioned on this slide are some of those policies, our menopause policy and our baby loss policy. I think just to show that our work in this area is moving beyond legally protected characteristics and a much more kind of comprehensive view of what does it really mean to be an inclusive employer. Obviously, we're only part of the way through 2023, but in April, I was delighted to speak to our third cohort who are on the Emerging Leaders programme. I think that programme is really building momentum, and as come on to see in a wee minute, we're starting to see that feeding through into our data. And then again, just mentioning the passport and neurodiversity, continuing the theme that we're looking beyond legally protected characteristics. So, in terms of achievements or sort of reflections back against the challenges, the 5 challenges that Gordon mentioned earlier, I think undoubtedly we have got real focus on this area. It's a very important part of my role as chair of the firm, but it's also very important to our board and to the wider partnership, and it's something that we also communicate about a lot. We talk about it internally, we talk about it externally. We provide regular updates to colleagues, and it's also increasingly forming part of the conversation we're having with clients, and particularly those who are PLCs. I've already touched on resources and the benefits I think we've had in making that investment, not just in our dedicated post, but also in some of the software that I mentioned earlier. And that has really helped us with our work on data collection and analysis. I think we now have a much, much better understanding of the demographics of our firm and of our colleagues, and we are now in a position where we're able to use that data to help inform the approach we're going to take around recruitment, some of our outreach work that we do to try and encourage students to join the profession, and it's also helping us look at issues around retention and progression. And again, we are finding that many of our PLC clients are actually asking us now to share that data with them. So we've got confidence in the data that we've got. We are really pleased that our completion rates against some of the benchmarks that I've learned about over the last few years are pretty high, and I think that culturally that shows the confidence that colleagues have in both in the data that we collect, but importantly in how we use it, and they understand what we're doing it for. And Gordon's talked about standards already, and we do work with a number of external organisations, and we are making progress in terms of a number of the rankings that we participate in. And obviously that's always nice to be recognised, but for me, I think it's been the process of challenge through accreditation and re-accreditation that's really been of most benefit to us. In terms of focus, gender and ethnicity are the two metrics that we as a firm have decided to track most closely. And if I look at how we're achieving there, in terms of gender, looking at the senior leadership positions across the business as a whole, so all roles, we've improved female representation up to 37%. On the legal side, for each of the last 2 years, women have made up more than 50% of promotions to our most senior legal positions of legal director and partner. And importantly, I would say, because this always comes up in a discussion, that has been absolutely on merit. We've not adopted any quotas, but I think what it has shown is the benefit of that one-to-one coaching that the delegates who are on our Emerging Leaders programme benefit from. The proportion of female partners, that's a really difficult stat to shift. We have moved it slightly from 2017 to now. We've moved up to from 24 to 27%, but we recognise that is going to be a generational change. That is going to take time to work through. But one statistic which gave me huge encouragement was when we analysed the data looking at partners who are under 45, then the representation of women increases to 40%. So I think that bodes incredibly well for the future and for the future leadership of the firm. Ethnicity, that's a very different challenge we have. Obviously, that challenge is around attracting students into the legal profession, and within that challenging challenges getting people into commercial legal roles, and we're not alone in facing that challenge. But what we can now see is the applications we're receiving for things like summer placement programmes and graduate recruitment are much more racially diverse, and I think that's very clearly linked to the work we've done with schools and universities. And we've seen an increased proportion of Black and minority ethnic students starting training contracts with us. We have a long way to go, but it's moving in a positive direction. It's not, as I said when I was talking to clients about this last week, it's not something that is going to be done and ticked off. It's a bit like the Forth Road Bridge. Once you get through one project, you have to start again on the next. But I think we are making good progress. Louisa.
Thank you, Gillian. We can pick up a couple of the questions at the end, but Gordon, I'll pass to you for the Menti.
Of course, yes. So we've got the opportunity now just for colleagues to react, if you like, to the description that you've both given of this firm's journey, ESG journey, and whether there's any thoughts that sparked on the part of colleagues. Just a free text this time to chip in if you have any thoughts. But while people are perhaps thinking about it, as you say, Louisa, there was a couple of points which I might actually pick up from the Q&A for each of you. Actually, one's principally for you, Louisa, and the other for Gillian. For you, Louisa, there was the question posed about, in light of COVID, working from home, when one's thinking about carbon usage. That's an interesting challenge when it comes to the workforce being as dispersed as it is. How do we deal with that? And then the one for Gillian to reflect on is, as well as the gender and ethnicity dimensions that you described, what sort of role disability played in our journey or our thinking. So yeah, Louisa.
Thank you, Gordon. Yeah, so we are measuring carbon usage for staff working from home, and actually it's been one of the challenges for us, measuring the carbon footprint and looking at the three scopes in terms of the standards. We are now having to measure the office, and we are measuring staff commuting. And some of that data we are using a kind of postcode analysis for that. And we are also having to measure for staff working from home. So we are trying to report on all of that. And inevitably the challenge for me in terms of the data and trying to get the data down is because of this sort of change in working patterns, we're having to accommodate all of that. So it does feel a little bit like running to stand still. But yes, our environmental consultants, I have to say, have been incredibly helpful, and you know, they ensure that there is, it's as I understand it, it's smoothed data that is used for that at the moment because of the issues of trying to do it on a kind of person by person basis. Thank you, Gordon, and thank you for the question.
And Gillian, do you want to pick?
Yeah, do you
pick
want me
up
to pick that up?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, quite right. It's not just about gender and ethnicity. I said they were the sort of two areas that we're focused primarily on, but disability has been one of the data sets that we've collected since the outset, along with social mobility and LGBT representation. We've been a disability confident employer for a good number of years now, so it's an area that we've worked again with an external organisation to help inform our thinking as to what we can do. And it's actually come up in some of the discussions with our clients. I mentioned the workplace adjustment passport that we developed last year, which we're just in the course of launching at the moment. And the idea behind that came from a discussion with one of our PLC clients, because they had recently learned about it and introduced it into their organisation. And the idea behind that is that those who have to have particular accommodations for their disability, whether that's a physical disability or a hidden disability, as they move around, it's particularly important for us when we have trainees who move around, or apprentices who move around the organisation and work in different teams, that they agree their personal adjustments once, and then that passport kind of travels with them as they move around the organisation, so they don't have to have multiple conversations, so that their new line managers are informed as to what their adjustments, agreed adjustments are. I think the other aspect of looking at disability has been that training piece. We've created, I think, a culture where we talk a lot more, particularly around hidden disabilities. I mentioned on the slide the work we're starting to do around neurodiversity, but we also had a speaker at our International Women's Day event in 2022, I think it was, who had a hidden disability, and she spoke very powerfully about the impact that had had on her, not just in her professional life, but also in her personal life, and some of the challenges that she had faced into. So I think it's been about informing colleagues of the challenges and having better awareness, so that really genuinely being an inclusive employer for those who've got any disability.
Great. And there was one other point which I thought I might pick up. Colleagues asking about the risk of businesses favouring those initiatives and exercises that are sort of most easily achieved, sort of the dilution effect, or the superficiality problem that I touched on briefly, and I think you picked up on very briefly, Gillian, in terms of pay for play invitations that we from time to time receive. And I do think that's a huge problem. It's one of the things that I do think about a lot, and I think there's a role for stakeholders across the piece, whether it's regulators or consumers themselves or other types of stakeholder in driving out that sort of superficial approach, and looking at the way in which those who are tasked with setting and monitoring standards behave ethically themselves. So that, for example, and there have been a number of cases of this, looking at the risk of conflicts of interest on the part of those who are setting standards against perhaps benefiting from selling services, or gaining some sort of benefit themselves through the adoption or deployment of the standard in question. I don't know, Gillian.
Yeah, I think so. I think my observation in looking at this sort of people side of things is it's very easy to put out on your website you know, benchmarks or targets that you're aiming for, and without really having in place a clear plan as to how you're going to deliver them. I certainly did an exercise a couple of years ago where I looked at some of the publicity that had been issued in our sector when gender pay gap reporting first came out, and some of the targets that had been set by a whole range of firms, including some of the largest law firms in the UK. And when I actually then did the kind of follow-up, so that a number of those commitments, if you like, had kind of quietly disappeared into the background. We all like to think that, you know, we can affect change but actually we have to be realistic. This is, as the questioner said, it's very nuanced, and it is actually pretty difficult to shift the dial in some areas. So I think we have to caution against I think virtue signalling in this area, and make sure that what you're doing is an authentic, forward-looking journey. And actually, as long as you understand where you are, what you're doing, what your own challenges are, and what you're doing to track them, and how they compare within your own sector, your own geography, then I think that's a much more useful starting point than as I say, some of the very laudable kind of targets that are actually not, or ambitious targets that are maybe not as achievable.
Thank you, and thank you both. There's a couple of, just very briefly before we finish, there was a couple of questions about, you know, the extension of some of the standards, and I think we will see some of the legal points coming through there. We've got the task force for financial disclosures moving on to the nature ones, and we will be doing future sessions on both procurement, supply chain and contractual terms. So there are absolutely climate contractual terms that can be put in, but I think what we'll do is we'll pick them up in significantly more detail, but do feel free to reach out. You know, one of the things that we're all looking at here is making sure we've got the correct contractual terms, but that we're also recognising the evolution of you know, operations as we go. We have our next webinar, and thank you all for coming this morning. We've got our next webinar, which is going to be on the morning of the 13th of June. So I would commend this one. What we're going to focus on, so we're basically today doing this broad overview. The next one is going to be, what are the real litigation challenges that are coming up? So we're seeing significant rises in activist litigation, the way that is funded, and also the reputational damage for organisations where it goes wrong. We're bringing in colleagues from our litigation team, John McKenzie, Matt Phillip, and we'll also be joined on that webinar by Message Matters, Peter Duncan and Andy McKeever, who will be talking through the communication challenges where reputation management becomes an issue, and that whole litigation piece. So again, a good one for all sectors. So I would recommend that one to you, and we will look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you so much for your attendance this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.